Audrey never got to say goodbye to her father. Not because she didn't try. She called, she drove to the house. She sent messages through every channel available to her and received back a version of the same answer, that her father was resting, that he wasn't up for visitors, that she should give him space and wait for him to reach out when he was ready. She waited. She gave space. She trusted the person delivering the message because that person was her mother, and you don't spend 31 years of your life building the instinct to doubt your own mother overnight. Her father died on a Thursday morning in March. Audrey wasn't there. She hadn't seen him in 93 days. 3 months of calls and messages and drives to a house where she was always turned away by a woman who had told her, consistently, warmly, convincingly, that her father needed rest and quiet and that Audrey's visits were too stressful for him in his condition. Her father had not said any of that. Her father had been saying something entirely different. He had been saying it into a recorder, alone in his room, for 3 months. Because he knew his time was running out, and he knew his voice was the only thing that would reach his daughter after he was gone. His attorney delivered the box on a Tuesday. And everything Audrey's mother had built, every carefully managed message, every turned-away visit, every fabricated reason, collapsed under the weight of a dying man's voice telling his daughter the truth. He recorded everything, alone in his room, for 3 months. Subscribe and ring that bell, because what Audrey hears on those recordings is something no daughter should ever have to learn about her own mother. My name is Audrey Calloway. I'm 31 years old and I live in Portland, Oregon. My father was the person in my life who made me feel most completely known, not in a performed or sentimental way, in the specific, practical way of someone who paid attention and remembered what he noticed. He knew my coffee order changed depending on my mood. He knew when I was pretending something was fine. He called on Tuesday evenings because he had learned years ago that Tuesdays were when I most needed to hear a familiar voice, and he had never once explained how he knew that. He just called. We talked about everything and nothing, and the line between those two categories was always blissfully unclear. He was my father completely, and I was his daughter completely, and that was the most solid thing in my world. My parents' marriage was long and complicated in the way that long marriages sometimes are, held together by history and habit, and a version of love that had calcified into something more structural than warm over the years. My mother was a managing person. That is the most honest and least unkind way I know to describe her. She organized things, schedules, narratives, other people's perceptions, the flow of information through the family. My father was quieter and more interior, and had learned over decades to move through her management with the patient navigation of someone who had made a private peace with the shape of his life. I had grown up watching this dynamic without fully naming it. I understood it the way you understand the furniture in a house you grew up in completely, and without ever having to think about it consciously. My father was diagnosed in November. Pancreatic cancer, the kind of diagnosis that arrives with a timeline already attached, that doesn't offer much negotiating room. I was in Portland when my mother called, and I was in my car driving to Seattle within 40 minutes of hanging up. The drive was 3 hours, and I spent most of it on the phone with my father, who sounded like himself, quieter than usual, but himself. He told me he was glad I was coming. He used my name twice in the conversation, which he only did when something mattered. I arrived at the house that evening and my mother met me at the door with a warmth that felt slightly organized, the specific warmth of someone who has decided in advance what register the evening will operate in. The second visit was when it started. I drove up from Portland on a Saturday 2 weeks after the diagnosis, unannounced, which I had always done with my parents because my father liked surprises and my mother tolerated them. My mother met me on the porch before I reached the door. She was warm and apologetic in equal measure. My father had had a difficult night. He was sleeping. The doctors had said that rest was the most important thing right now, and that stimulating visits sometimes set back his recovery. She suggested I come back in a week when he was more stable. I stood on that porch and looked at the house behind her and felt something I couldn't immediately identify. Not anger, not suspicion, something quieter and more uncertain. I drove back to Portland and told myself she was right and I should listen. Over the following weeks, the deflections became consistent. I would call and my mother would answer and tell me my father was resting. I would text and receive responses from my mother's phone, sometimes saying he had seen it and sent his love, sometimes explaining he was too fatigued to respond directly. I drove up twice more and was met both times with gentle, reasonable explanations for why it wasn't a good time. Each individual instance was explainable. A difficult treatment day. A bad night. a period of increased fatigue the doctors had anticipated. My mother delivered each explanation with the smooth credibility of someone who had been managing information her entire life and was very good at it. But the pattern of them, the consistency, the completeness, the way they always arrived with just enough detail to seem real, was starting to feel like architecture. I started writing things down in early January. Not dramatically, not because I had formed a specific theory or made an accusation even inside my own head, but because something in me understood that what I was experiencing needed a witness and I was the only one available. I noted the dates of my calls and what I was told, the dates of my drives to Seattle and what reason was given for turning me away. The last time I had spoken directly to my father, actually heard his voice, not a relayed message, which by mid-January had been 19 days. I kept the record in a notes app on my phone. I didn't show it to anyone. I didn't fully know yet what I was keeping it for, but I kept it with the quiet instinct of someone who knows that something is happening and that someday the record of it will matter. My father died on a Thursday morning in March. I learned about it through a text message from my mother sent 40 minutes after it happened. 4 sentences. Factual, gentle, the kind of message that had clearly been composed rather than written in the immediate aftermath of something. I sat on my kitchen floor in Portland and read it 4 times. The timestamp showed 40 minutes had passed. 40 minutes during which my mother had been in that house with my father's absence and had used some portion of that time to compose a 4-sentence text message to their daughter. I had not seen my father in 93 days. I had not heard his voice directly in 61. I sat on my kitchen floor and held my phone and understood with the specific clarity that grief sometimes delivers that something had been done to me. I just didn't know yet what my father had done to make sure I would find out. I drove to Seattle the morning after the text. The house looked the same from the outside. The same garden my father had tended every spring, the same porch light he always left on regardless of the hour, the same front door I had stood outside of twice in the final months being gently and credibly turned away. Inside, it felt different in the specific way that houses feel different after the person who anchored them is gone. My mother was composed and organized in the way she always was in situations that required management, funeral arrangements already begun, calls already made, the practical infrastructure of death already being assembled with the efficiency I had watched her apply to everything her entire life. I moved through the house quietly and noticed things. Small things. The kind that don't mean anything individually and mean everything together. The call came on Friday evening while I was still in Seattle. A number I didn't recognize, Seattle area code. I almost let it go to voicemail, and then didn't, which was one of those small decisions that changed everything downstream. The man on the line introduced himself as Robert Stein, my father's attorney of 11 years. He said he was sorry for my loss and that he was calling because my father had left specific instructions regarding certain materials that were to be delivered directly to me. He said directly with a particular emphasis that I registered immediately. Not through the estate, not through my mother, directly to me. He asked if I could come to his office the following Tuesday. He asked that I come alone. He said my father had been very specific about that part. Robert Stein's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown with a view of Puget Sound that my father would have appreciated. Robert was in his 60s, steady, unhurried, with the specific gravity of someone carrying something that belonged to another person and was taking that responsibility seriously. He shook my hand and offered water and then sat across from me and placed a box on the desk between us. It was a shoebox, one of my father's. I recognized it, brown with a faded logo on the side. My name was written on the top in his handwriting. Blue pen. The particular slant of his letters that I had been reading my entire life on birthday cards and grocery lists and notes left on the kitchen counter. I looked at the box and then at Robert and he nodded once. I opened the box carefully. Inside was a letter folded in thirds in an envelope with my name on the front. Beneath it, a small digital recorder, the kind you could buy at any office supply store, unremarkable, a little worn on one corner like it had been handled frequently. And beneath the recorder, a piece of paper listing 11 audio files by date. The dates began in December and ended 4 days before his death in March. 3 months of dates, one for almost every week of the time I had been turned away from that house. I picked up the recorder and held it and looked at the dates on that list, and something moved through me that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite anger but carried the weight of both simultaneously. Then I pressed play on the first file. His voice came out of the recorder, and I had to stop the playback within the first 30 seconds. Not because of what he was saying, because of how he sounded. I had last heard my father's voice 61 days before his death. In those 61 days, his voice had changed in the way that voices change when the body carrying them is working very hard just to remain. It was still him, completely, recognizably him, but quieter, more effortful. Like someone speaking carefully to make sure each word landed with its full weight. I sat in Robert Stein's office with a box of my father's recordings in my lap and pressed play a second time and made myself listen. His first words were my name, just my name, said the way he always said it, like it was something worth taking a moment over. The first 3 recordings were made in December, the period when I had still been driving to Seattle and being met at the door with explanations. My father's voice in those recordings described asking for me, repeatedly, asking his wife where I was, asking why I hadn't come. The answers he received, captured in his own words as he recorded what was happening, were that I had called to say I was too busy, that work was demanding, that I had said I would come when things settled down. He recorded these explanations with a quietness that I recognized as his version of trying to accept something that didn't sit right with him. He said in the second recording, "I don't think that sounds like Audrey." Then a long pause, then, "I'm going to keep recording just in case." The 11th recording was made 4 days before he died. His voice by that point required real effort, each sentence built slowly, with pauses that the previous recordings hadn't contained. He spoke about me for most of it. Specific memories, the Tuesday evening calls, the coffee order that changed with my mood, a road trip we had taken when I was 19 that he described in enough detail that I had to press pause and look at the ceiling for a moment before I could continue listening. Then, near the end of the recording, he said something that I will carry for the rest of my life. He said he didn't know why I hadn't come, but that he had decided it didn't matter because he knew me and he knew I would have come if I could, and that was enough. He said he loved me. Then the recording ended. Robert Stein had placed the tissue box on the desk without me noticing. I used several of them. He looked at his desk and gave me whatever time I needed. I drove back to Portland on Wednesday with the box on my passenger seat. I didn't play the recordings in the car. I needed to be somewhere still and private for that. I made it home by early afternoon, fed the cat, made tea I didn't drink, and sat at my kitchen table with the recorder and the list of 11 files and started from the beginning. I listened to all of them across 2 days. Not continuously, I would listen for a while and then need to stop and be somewhere else for an hour before coming back. I took notes. Not clinical ones, just words and phrases that I needed to capture outside of my own head before they became too heavy to hold there. By the end of the second day, I had the complete picture. It was worse than I had allowed myself to imagine. The recording from the third week of December contained the specific detail that moved everything from suspicion into something colder and more definitive. My father described a conversation with my mother in which she had told him, directly, sitting beside his bed, that I had called that morning to say I was too busy with a work project to make the drive up that weekend. He repeated the exact wording she had used, speaking slowly and carefully into the recorder like he wanted to make sure it was captured accurately. I had made no such call. I had called 3 times that week and spoken to my mother each time and been told my father was resting. The lie wasn't an omission or a softened version of something real. It was constructed, specific, delivered to a dying man about his daughter. What my mother had built was a two-sided structure. On my side, she had delivered reasons why my father wasn't available for visits, fatigue, rest, medical advice, the gentle insistence that space was what he needed. On his side, she had delivered reasons why I wasn't coming, busyness, work, my supposed emotional difficulty with illness. Both sides are plausible. Both sides delivered with the same warm, credible concern. Each of us received a version of the other that made absence feel explained rather than engineered. My father recorded his side of it with the meticulous care of a man who suspected the explanation didn't hold but couldn't prove it from inside a bedroom. He was too weak to leave. Hearing his version alongside my own experience of those same months was like watching a map of something deliberately built. The recording from late January captured a moment I had to listen to twice. My father's voice, weaker by that point, the sentences shorter, described asking the home nurse who came on Tuesday and Thursday mornings to help him contact me directly. He wanted her to use her personal phone to call me. He described making this request clearly and specifically. The nurse, he didn't name her but described her carefully, had responded with a kindness that didn't include yes. She had said she would mention it. She had said she understood. She had not used her phone. In the following recording, made 4 days later, my father noted that the nurse had not mentioned it again and that he had stopped asking because asking and receiving nothing in return was its own kind of answer. My father mentioned the will in 2 separate recordings, once in passing and once with a specificity that told me he had thought about it carefully before deciding to record it. In the final weeks, he had wanted to make a change. Not a dramatic restructuring, a specific addition that he described in enough detail for me to understand its significance without him stating the legal particulars directly. He had raised it with my mother. She had told him the attorney was traveling. Then Robert was unavailable for new matters until after the new year. Then it could wait until he was stronger and could go to the office himself. 3 separate explanations across 3 weeks. Each one closing the door on a conversation he was trying to have before he ran out of time to have it. I called Robert Stein on Thursday morning after 2 days with the recordings. I told him what the recordings contained regarding the will and asked him directly whether he had been traveling or unavailable during the period my father had apparently been trying to reach him. Robert was quiet for a moment before answering. Then he told me that he had not been traveling. That he had in fact attempted to contact my father twice in January through the house line and had been told by my mother that my father was too ill for legal matters and would be in touch when he was able. He said he had accepted that explanation because he had no reason at that point not to. He said he was telling me now because my father had instructed him to answer my questions completely and without reservation. I thanked him and sat with that for a long time. By Thursday evening, I had assembled everything into a shape I could see clearly. Systematic redirection of my contact, attempts across 93 days. Fabricated explanations delivered to my father about my absence. A home nurse who had been present for his request for help and had not provided it. 3 blocked attempts to reach his attorney about a will change. And 11 recordings made by a man who knew he was dying and knew something was being done and left his voice behind as the only witness available to him. I sat at my kitchen table in Portland and looked at my notes and understood the full architecture of what had been built in that Seattle house while my father was inside it asking for me. Then I picked up the phone and called a family law attorney whose number a friend had given me 3 months earlier when I first told her something felt wrong. The family law attorney's name was Claire Nakamura, and she practiced out of a Portland office that felt deliberately calm, neutral colors, good light, the kind of space designed to make people feel stable while discussing unstable things. I brought everything. The recorder, the list of 11 files, my notes from 2 days of listening, the record I had kept on my phone of every blocked call and turned away visit, Robert Stein's confirmation about the will and the unanswered contact attempts. Claire listened to me present all of it with the focused attention of someone organizing information into categories as it arrives. When I finished, she asked 3 precise questions. Then she sat back and told me what I was looking at legally. The language she used was measured and specific and left very little room for the interpretation that this had been anything other than deliberate. Claire recommended I speak with a grief counselor before making any decisions about next steps. Not as a deflection, she was explicit that the legal path forward was clear and available whenever I was ready. But she said that what I was processing was not one thing. It was grief for my father, loss of the time that had been taken from us, and betrayal by my mother, 3 separate weights arriving simultaneously and requiring different kinds of attention. She gave me a name. I made the appointment for the following week. I want to be honest about this part of the story because it matters. I was not okay during this period. I was functional and deliberate and making good decisions, but underneath all of that I was a daughter who had not got to say goodbye and was learning why in the worst possible increments. Her name was taken from the home care agency records that Robert provided. He had access to the billing documentation from my father's care and shared it with appropriate authorization. Her name was Connie. I found her contact information through the agency and called on a Wednesday afternoon with the careful opening of someone who understood that the person on the other end of the line might not want to have this conversation. Connie picked up. I introduced myself and told her I was Gerald Calloway's daughter. There was a pause on her end that lasted long enough to tell me she remembered the situation and had been carrying something about it. She didn't confirm everything immediately. But over 20 minutes she told me enough, in the careful, hedged language of someone describing what they witnessed without fully naming what it meant, that what she said aligned precisely with what my father had recorded. I wrote my mother a letter on a Thursday night that I never sent. I needed to write it before I could do anything else, needed to put everything I knew into sentences addressed to the person responsible for it, if only to confirm to myself that I understood the full shape of it before I brought it into any room with other people present. I wrote for 2 hours. I said everything. The 93 days, the fabricated explanations, the recordings, the will, the nurse who hadn't used her phone. I wrote it with the specific clarity that comes from having processed something completely and arrived on the other side of the emotional phase of it. When I finished, I read it once, saved it to a folder on my laptop, and closed the document. It had done what I needed it to do. The version I was going to deliver in person was going to be different, shorter, and I was going to let my father's voice carry most of it. My father had two friends he had known since his 30s, men he had lunch with monthly and called on Saturday mornings, and trusted in the quiet, consistent way that long friendships earn. I contacted both of them. The first, a man named Warren, told me that he had visited my father twice in the final months and that my mother had been present for both visits. He said my father had asked about me during the second visit, asked Warren directly if he had heard from me. My mother had answered before Warren could, saying I had been in touch and was planning to visit soon. My father had looked at Warren with an expression Warren described as like he was hoping I'd say something different. Warren hadn't understood what he was seeing at the time. He understood it completely when I told him about the recordings. By the time I requested the formal meeting with my mother, I had everything organized into a single coherent picture. 11 recordings in my father's voice. Robert Stein's documented confirmation of the blocked will change and unanswered contact attempts. Connie's account from the home care visits. Warren's testimony about my father's expression when asking about me. My own phone record of 93 days of redirected calls and turned away visits. Claire had reviewed all of it and prepared a formal summary document. I asked my mother for a meeting at a neutral location, a conference room Robert Stein offered the use of, which I chose deliberately because its formality would signal to my mother before she walked in that this was not a grief conversation. She agreed to come. She brought her attorney. I had expected that. I arrived at Robert's conference room 40 minutes early. Claire was already there. Robert sat at the end of the table with his own documentation. I placed the recorder in the center of the table. The same shoebox recorder my father had used, the worn corner facing up, unremarkable and devastating in equal measure. I arranged everything else in the order I intended to use it, and then I sat back and looked at the conference room and thought about my father alone in his room making 11 recordings, because he knew his voice was the only thing that would reach me after he was gone. My mother walked in at 2 o'clock with her attorney, a man named Gerald Fitch who had a practiced, composed expression that didn't fully survive the first 30 seconds of understanding what kind of meeting he had walked into. I didn't open with the recorder. I opened with questions. Calm, direct, specific questions about the 93 days, asked in the same sequence the events had actually occurred so that my mother's answers would build a structure I could then dismantle precisely rather than generally. I asked about the first turned-away visit in December, about the calls I had made that she had answered on my father's behalf, about the specific Saturday she had told me he was too tired for company. She answered all of them, smoothly, consistently, with the practiced credibility of someone who had been telling this version of events long enough that it had acquired the texture of memory rather than construction. Her attorney sat beside her saying nothing. I listened to every answer and wrote nothing down and let her build the structure completely before I touched any of it. My mother's account of the 93 days was internally consistent in the way that carefully maintained stories are, each element supporting the others, the explanations interlocking, the overall shape of it coherent enough to be believable in a room where it wasn't being tested against anything external. She spoke about my father's medical condition with genuine medical detail that she had clearly absorbed across months of caregiving. She framed her management of his visitors as protective, a wife doing what the doctors recommended and what her husband needed. She said she had kept me updated as best she could given the circumstances. She said it had been an incredibly difficult time for everyone. Her attorney nodded at appropriate intervals. I waited until she had finished completely. Then I looked at the recorder in the center of the table and said, "My father kept a record of those months too." My mother looked at the recorder with an expression that moved through several stages quickly. Recognition first, because she had seen it in his room, then calculation, then something that I can only describe as the specific quality of composure being held by considerable effort rather than natural stability. Her attorney leaned slightly forward and asked what the device was. I told him it was a digital recorder my father had used in the final 3 months of his life to document his experience during his illness. I told him the recordings had been delivered to me by Robert Stein pursuant to my father's explicit instructions. I told him there were 11 files. I told him the first one was 4 minutes long and that I thought it would be useful for everyone in the room to hear it before we continued the conversation. Then I pressed play. My father's voice came into that conference room and everything else stopped. His voice in the first December recording, tired but clear, still carrying the specific cadence I had been hearing my whole life, described asking for me, described being told I had called to say I was too busy, described sitting with that explanation in the way he sat with things that didn't quite land right. The recording was 4 minutes and 11 seconds long. When it ended, the room was completely silent. My mother had her hands flat on the conference table and was looking at a point somewhere past the recorder. Her attorney had stopped his periodic nodding. Robert sat at the end of the table with his hands folded. Claire had her pen down. My mother did not speak for a very long time. When she finally did, what came out was not an explanation. It was just my name, said the way my father used to say it. Robert spoke next. He presented his documentation with the methodical precision of someone who had been carrying it carefully and was now prepared to set it down in the right place. The two unanswered contact attempts in January. The billing records showing Connie's presence on the days my father had asked for help reaching me. The 3 separate dates on which my father had raised the will changed, and the 3 corresponding explanations he had received for why it couldn't be addressed. Robert presented each item without editorial, just documentation, dated and sourced, laid into the record of the meeting with the quiet authority of things that had simply happened and been noted. Gerald Fitch, my mother's attorney, had stopped performing composure approximately halfway through Robert's presentation. By the end, he was looking at his own legal pad and had written nothing on it in several minutes. Claire presented the full assembled picture last: the recordings, Robert's documentation, Connie's account, Warren's testimony, my phone record of 93 days. She laid it out in the measured language of a legal summary, each element connected to the next, the complete structure of what had been made visible in a single coherent presentation. When she finished, she looked at Gerald Fitch and asked if his client wished to respond to any specific element of what had been presented. Gerald Fitch looked at my mother. My mother was still looking at the point past the recorder. He looked back at Claire and said he would need to confer with his client before any response was given. Claire said, of course. Robert noted the time for the record. The room held the specific silence of something that had been fully seen and could not be unseen, and everyone present understood that. I walked out of Robert Stein's building at 4:17 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. The Seattle sky was doing what Seattle skies do in early spring, undecided, layered, light coming through, in pieces between clouds that hadn't committed to anything yet. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment before walking to my car. I thought about my father in his room with that small recorder, the worn corner, the office supply store unremarkability of it, the 11 dates on that list spanning 3 months of a dying man talking into a device because he understood his voice was the only bridge that would reach his daughter after he was gone. He had been right. It had reached me. Across the distance my mother had built and the 93 days and the grief and the legal conference rooms, his voice had reached me completely. I got in my car. I drove toward Portland. And somewhere on the interstate with the city disappearing behind me, I said out loud, to no one, to him, to the particular quality of light coming through my windshield, that I had heard him, that I was here, that I had always been coming.